all these composers have a personal style, and we grow up being told, the obvious, like, oh, do your own thing, have your own style, that's what sets you apart, blah, 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 blah. But nobody tells you how to actually do that, right?
Yeah.
So I actually kind of tried to figure it out, at least in the context of the type of music I was interested in.
This is Patrick O'Malley, composer, and we're very excited to have you on. We've been friends for a long time. Mm-hmm. We've known each other since USC days, which is like, what, 2000?
Almost 10 years.
13? Yeah. 2012, something like that?
I started in 2013.
2013, right. Yeah. And I was probably a third year undergrad by then.
Yeah, you were either a junior or a senior.
Yeah, I was a baby. You were a master's student, I think.
I came in as a master's student.
Yeah. And then you kept going there and going there and going there while I ditched the West Coast.
Well, I really liked Los Angeles, and I really liked USC. And it was my experience as a master's student at that particular school was, I think, way better than I expected it to be. And it just made sense, like, hey, I'm in the city. If I have to live in a big city, LA seems to be the best one that fits me. And if I stay at USC for the doctorate, like, I checked the curriculum and everything. It was like, oh, I can finish everything more or less by the time I'm 29 or 30 and just be like done with it.
So you were at USC for your master's, you decided to stay for your doctorate. Mm-hmm. What was your expectation going into it? You said it was exceeded your expectation.
Well,
what was it going into it?
I went to Northwestern for my undergrad. And I don't come from my family, I don't have any professional musicians in my family. I have music lovers in my family, thankfully, but not any professional musicians. So we kind of just, when it came to selecting an undergrad, it was just kind of like apply to, the list of good music schools and then go to whichever one seems to be the best one you can get into. That was really all the logic that went into it. So I wound up at Northwestern, and Northwestern doesn't have a traditional master's program. They have their undergrad, and then they have their doctorate program, which is sort of like, at least when I was there, it was like a combined master's and doctoral program. I don't know exactly how it worked because I didn't do it, obviously. But one of the things that was kind of weird about Northwestern was there are all these undergrads there, obviously, and then the doctoral students who were typically much older and much more interested in a very different kind of music than the undergrads were. It was, they were all into, much weirder stuff than the undergrads typically were into. And it was also a small department. So I was like, in my year, I think there were 4 of us. And I was into kind of classical concert music and orchestral film scoring. Another guy was only interested in musical theater. And of course, Northwestern had a big theater program, so it made sense for him to be there for that. Another guy in my year was a composer named Zach Robinson, who now scores Cobra Kai.
Wow.
And he was always into film scoring, but much more from like a rock synth band sort of perspective. He didn't do a whole lot with orchestra, although he does know how to do that stuff. And then I think the 4th guy was into like nothing but chamber music. So it was like a very small department. Everyone was kind of into different things on their own in the undergrad. The faculty were much more kind of avant-garde, cutting-edge new music type of people, and the doctoral students were kind of in line with that. That's who they wanted to study with. So in retrospect, that was very different than coming to USC, which had a slightly bigger department. And when I got there, I realized that, everybody's kind of stylistically much more synced up with what I'm interested in doing. but they all seem to be better at it than I am, and that kind of fed into me kind of really wanting to, I think, get better at what I was doing and take my music more seriously. And obviously the faculty likewise were doing stuff that I was more interested in than at Northwestern. So it kind of changed my perspective on, what the purpose or what the usefulness of grad school could be. Because when myself and my colleagues at Northwestern, we kind of just secretly thought, we would joke that because the doctoral students were writing such weird music, we just all thought a doctor was what you did if you couldn't get anyone to play your music. And so that's how much of a divide.
That's crazy.
Because the undergrads and doctorates at Northwestern really didn't hang out or do anything together, which was not so much the case at USC. There was much more interest between the different degree programs of what people were doing. And so the master's degree program at USC was pretty, I think, transformative for me. I think that's when I really started to, start to churn out stuff that I look back on and actually find interesting. And
you mean the music you were writing there?
Right.
At the time that you were there?
Yes.
Okay.
And when 2015 rolled around, or the end of 2014, it just felt like I really had a great time there, was having a good time, and it's like, I could stay at the school, have all those resources available to me for like another 3 or 4 years, while still being in LA and still being able to, go out into concerts and meet musicians and all the typical things that people do when they're starting to try and get their stuff played or find opportunities. So that's what I did, and I have no regrets about it whatsoever.
And you realized that you were writing the music that you wanted to write while you were at USC. I mean, that seems to be like the biggest
I think I was always writing
thing.
the music I wanted to write, but in terms of like really holding myself to a high standard, I think that's what changed. There wasn't really, I don't think I've ever gone through what you would call like a stylistic, paradigm shift. But I think the biggest thing for me that has changed is like the standard and the quality that I am trying to hold my music up to when I write and put something out there.
And while you were at Northwestern, I mean, it's different when you're 18, 19,
exactly.
20 years
You're also
old.
younger, so yeah.
You're younger, you don't know as much,
right?
Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
but also you weren't really surrounded by people that were stylistically necessarily interested.
I really
in what
didn't
you're doing.
have too much to compare myself to, and although the faculty at Northwestern were good, and I certainly learned all the basics very well, I don't think the faculty really pushed me that hard either, in terms of like, your stuff sounds like these composers, you should really, delve into that whole thing and see what it is they're doing. It was more, here's what we, the faculty, are interested in, and some of that was useful for sure, but I think it felt like USC was getting me a lot more feedback, which I think really helped me get to what I'm writing today.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I feel like most people don't know much about USC just because there's like this kind of, not stigma, but most classical music is like contemporary classical music is centered in New York.
Yeah.
Or a little bit in Chicago and Boston as well.
Mm-hmm.
And people kind of gravitate towards them. I mean, we're like an hour out of Manhattan right now.
Yeah.
And I freaking grew up in LA and I'm still out here, like 8-9 years later
Sure.
after moving here. So there is that pull to be out here, I feel like, in the New York area. But there is something about being out in a place like LA where there's like, I felt like there was not much, at least at USC, I felt like there was not much pressure to write in any one particular way. And I did feel like while I was an undergrad, I mean, I was hanging out with people like you, master's student. At like Juilliard, for example, I mean, I did know the undergrads, but I feel like I was more just like trying to meet the undergrads more, just because at USC, that was my experience. Like the undergrads and the masters and the doctorates, they all mixed together. Well, there was no weird like oil and water thing going on between the different levels. And I think at Juilliard, I felt there was a lot more of that. Like what you're describing at Northwestern. And now I'm at Columbia, and there is a bit of that too, that oil water thing. But ironically, I feel like a lot of the Columbia undergrad composers write a little bit like the doctorate composers. They have the same kind of experimental mindset.
Yeah, I think Northwestern was definitely, the undergrad pool was very stylistically diverse. I think because obviously you're dealing with young people who may not have either figured out exactly what they want to do or have just not been exposed to everything that's out there in contemporary classical music yet. But yeah, the undergrads were very stylistically diverse, and the doctoral students were much more, homogenous.
What was the orchestra program like at Northwestern? Because now you write a lot of orchestra music. There was a time when me and you were like doing every orchestra reading there was in the U.S.
Yes.
Like a couple of years straight, pandemic times. Yeah. Like now that you mentioned Northwestern, like was there any like cross-pollination between the undergrads and the orchestra program, or like how did you develop?
I did. So there were opportunities to get things played. They were not particularly systematized. You kind of had to get a little bit lucky. So I think what ended up happening to me was, I was writing an orchestra piece. I was vaguely aware that every year, or at least every other year, there would be a concert with the Northwestern Symphony Orchestra devoted to concerto winners. They would have concerto competitions on the performance side of things, and there would be one concert out of the year where I think there'd be 3 winners, and they would play their concertos with the orchestra. And on that concert, there was an opportunity for a 4th piece to be played, which would have been an original piece by one of the student composers, which is a perfectly fine opportunity. The only thing that was weird about it was that it wasn't like at USC where first, when you interviewed there, they tell you all about the new music for orchestra program, and then every year you get those emails. Here's when it's due. Here's a reminder that it's due at the beginning, right after New Year's or whenever it's done. It's a very set up thing. And this concerto concert with one piece by a student was never had that sort of like, that feeling of like, it happens every year. It's a reason to come here. There was never that, but it did exist. And so I just happened to have finished an orchestra piece. It was called Superimpose my junior year, and managed to get it played on that concert. And that was like a 15-minute orchestra piece. And so that was really handy to have for the master's degree. So
when you were doing this piece, you were writing the orchestra piece, you knew that there was a possibility of getting it played on this concert.
I was aware of it, but it wasn't like I had to ask my teachers about
when is it due? Can I even do it?
Right.
Is it a waste of time?
Can I get an orchestra piece played? Because I remember I had a piece, an earlier orchestra piece, that I had written as a freshman, and I remember showing it to the teachers and them saying, "Oh, you should talk to Victor Yampolsky about having this played." And I actually met with him, who was the department chair of conducting and led the major orchestra concerts. And it just, nothing ever happened out of it. I showed him the piece, and he was like, "I'll see if I can get this played." And I just never heard back.
Right.
But, there was never, for the concerto concert where you could get a piece played, it was all very much figured out directly with my faculty members, my private teachers. I don't remember there being too many announcements in our weekly symposium.
But there was always a new piece every year.
I don't think it was every year. I think it was
Just kind of like on a...
If it fit the schedule, it happened. If it didn't, it didn't.
But what about with the doctorate students? Was there any like competition if there was only one new piece every year?
I think the wind ensembles had something more consistent for a large ensemble opportunity. I do remember big wind band pieces getting played. There was I think there was always an opportunity to have something played or considered for the contemporary ensemble, which was the sinfonietta-sized group.
15 players or less kind of situation.
So I actually had something played by them as a sophomore, but of course that's not the same thing as an orchestra, and that's kind of what I wanted to work up to. And the timing, I just got lucky with the timing that that the concert was happening and I had a piece that could be done in time.
Yeah, but this is the thing though. I feel like, especially when you're in school, I feel like a lot of people feel like they have to be in school for composition because there's a structure to it, right? Which there is. I mean, you take classes, there's your teacher, you have your lessons. Right. There is a lot of structure. But with things like this, where you actually want to put on a project, I feel like there's always this need to like have, you gotta make the first move. No one is gonna make it for you. And that kind of mindset continues after you're done.
Sure.
Like no one's gonna like tell you, hey, write this orchestra piece. You know? It's just not gonna happen. You gotta do it yourself.
Yeah, I think that was I probably learned a good lesson in that, getting all that, putting it out there to the faculty, hey, I want to write an orchestra piece, and then saying, okay, well, there's this, it looks like you could do it possibly on this thing. I do remember there may have been like 2 other submissions for that opportunity, but it wasn't something, and that was the thing about the department as a whole. There was not this kind of, I think the people interested in writing orchestra music was actually very much a minority at the Northwestern department. So I was able to get, as an undergrad, a 15-minute piece played. I think probably because the competition wasn't super hardcore.
I also feel that, I think it goes back to what I was saying before, is that if you don't really want to write an orchestra piece, no one, you know what I mean? It's not, right. Because I feel like most people want to write an orchestra piece. Like my colleagues at Columbia, for example, a lot of them haven't written orchestra pieces, but when you ask them, hey, would you like to write an orchestra piece? Almost all of them say yes. It's not about whether they want to or do it. They all would like to, but do they want to make the first move of writing the piece or figuring out how am I going to get this thing done? The answer is usually no.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think that's where the mind shift changes with you, for example.
Right. I mean, I grew up basically listening to nothing but some type of orchestral music for the vast majority, whether it be film music or classical music. So I definitely had, and to me, I just kind of, the orchestra just sort of made sense for me in terms of like, okay, you've got all the instruments and you start making a score. I mean, I don't know, it's just, I've never really been as interested in chamber music for whatever reason, although I am interested in it. I do write chamber music. So yeah, and it just, I remember, I think the first time I ever had an orchestra piece played was at Interlochen. I did one summer there, and they did have, like, you could write like a 3 to 5 minute thing, and you would get it read. You get like 10 minutes of time.
Interlochen is an academy for high school age students. So this is before going to Northwestern.
Yes, so I did, they have the high school program, and they also have the summer program, which is also for high school age. I did one summer there, and I wrote some little thing for it, and that went well enough, and I just knew that's what I wanted to do. So it was the music that I loved listening to, and so when it came time, so I was at Northwestern, and you have 4 years to work with, writing an orchestra piece, just kind of felt like the natural thing to do with my time.
Yeah, I felt the same way while I was at USC. It was like, like you said, it was the music I gravitated towards. Although I feel like the older I'm getting, I'm gravitating towards smaller settings for some reason. I don't know why, but I guess, but that's the thing. You want your music to change with you. As you're changing, you want to change. But if you're excited when you're young to write orchestra music, that's the best time to write orchestra music, I think, because you have the energy, you have the excitement, the enthusiasm.
I remember like staying up very late, night after night, in my little single college dorm working on that piece. And I think back to that, and now I'm like, I don't know if I could do that as much. If somebody was paying me enough money, I could do it. But
the only time I ever had an all-nighter, I think it was like 1 or 2 times, maybe. Maybe it was twice, but one of them I remember for sure. I was making parts for my first orchestra piece at USC. It's like, and that memory sticks with you. It's like when a comedian like is doing a stand-up show or something where like no one cares about their thing. You kind of have that similar vibe. That's like, but you care.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's why you remember it.
Right. Yeah.
I still pull late nights once in a while, but I'm much more cognizant about managing that time and saving my energy for those nights when they're gonna, be most useful.
Right, because we're getting older. We're both in our 30s. It's
we're more health conscious about, at least for me, trying to get enough sleep and all that.
So you went Northwestern, okay, you got to USC. I actually remember too, now that you mention it, I haven't thought about it in a while, but that first time I was at USC to do when they do the meet and greet with the prospective students, the first thing out of their mouth was the Need Music for Orchestra show. Yeah. And even for the undergrads that were there, that was a thing that they mentioned. And they made it a point that the undergrads could also
like every
apply.
Year
not just the graduate students.
There wasn't that. Northwestern definitely didn't make it a sales pitch. When you would ask them, they of course would say, yeah, there are opportunities, but it was never like hey, welcome to USC, guess what, we have this orchestra every year, and all you got to do is apply.
And not just one piece gets on. It's like 5 or 6
or 6
pieces, new pieces. This is not a pitch for USC or anything. Right. We just happen to.
This is just us. It's part of me kind of comparing my undergrad experience to my graduate experience.
Yeah,
and definitely. Kind of how one school, both schools were great, but definitely one fit my personality and interests more than the other.
Yeah, both schools will teach you the same things. Both schools will give you the structure that you need. Both schools, especially like Northwestern, also is like a proper research university, has other things besides music. Both schools are similar. They're both in huge cities, but when you're young, I always say to students, like when you're young, when you're 18, I almost say now, it's if you don't go to college without it being paid for, I'm even that far there, especially for composition.
For sure,
I wouldn't even go because there's so many amazing resources now that we
That's
didn't have 10 years ago.
That's something that I think about a lot, especially since I teach now. I do private lessons outside of LA now at CSUN, the Cal State Northridge, and most of my students are interested in the classical stuff, but I get a few that are interested in film as well. And certainly with the film stuff, it's even more of a question of like, do you need to go to school or not? And I'm at the point where it's like, you got to ask yourself a few questions. One is like, are you a good student? Do you actually enjoy going to school? How do you learn? Because for some people, they've just never been that way. Second, as far as the money's concerned, like, look at what tuition costs, and then what would happen if you took half or a portion of that money and just started buying gear. And then I think the one thing I would, if somebody asked me for advice, that I would highly recommend is still trying to find some sort of mentor, some sort of person doing what you would like to do, and either try and see if they'll give you private lessons or some sort of guidance. I think that is something that I'd recommend to anyone, whether they go to school or not, just so they have someone in the field to ask questions and to get real feedback from, because that's something you don't get from the YouTube videos and the online resources.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I mean, I think that things have worked out for me with the whole going to school thing. But certainly at Northwestern, there were several classes I took that I don't think added anything to my abilities as a composer or human being in general.
But we're also in that generation. I feel like I kind of feel like we're like the last. I don't want to sound like apocalyptic or anything, but I feel like we're in the last kind of group of composers where getting something tangible out of going to university, especially going all the way through to the end, the doctorate, has any tangible difference in making our music sound any different or pushing us further in.
I think for someone like me, who's like, very much into stuff like score study and learning the history of music and all that, and also into large ensemble stuff, I think school, the right school, mind you, still offers a lot of advantages, and I think there will always be people for whom that avenue is going to be the best thing. But certainly, I think it's shifting a little bit towards. Do you need to go to school? The answer is not going to be an immediate yes.
Yeah.
As much. It depends on the individual, and of course all the variables that go into it. But I think that certainly finding some sort of mentor is still going to be something I would always recommend to somebody. And if you can manage it, being in a place where you can go out and hear a lot of music, or have access to concerts, or things that you're interested in. So it's being able to live in some sort of metropolitan city, at least part of the time.
Yeah, figure out if you actually like doing it. Because I feel like it's still like very romanticized.
I mean, that's part of the reason I came to you. So when I applied for masters, I got into both Michigan and USC, and I came down to 2 or 3 days before the deadline to choose, before I had really made up my mind, because Michigan is also a great school. They're also, they're similar to USC stylistically, or at least in terms of people doing things that I myself would be interested in doing. And it was very, it's in a beautiful town, Ann Arbor, and it's very close to my family in Indiana and northern Michigan. But I think one of the things that made me choose USC over Michigan was, I grew up in Northeast Indiana. I just went to school at Northwestern, which is near Chicago, but not in Chicago. I think I should just go into the heart of a big city and try that. And that was one of the deciding factors, coming out to LA, for sure.
I mean, and it's also like, especially for a master's graduate degree, usually where you go, I mean, at least with me, my experience, and the people that I know, wherever they end up with their last degree, that's where they end up being long term. And I was always told this, as an undergrad, or that, wherever you go is probably where you're going to end up, long term. I just never really believed it. I'll always go back to LA and kind of these things. Or maybe you were, I don't know if you were thinking you would always go back to Michigan.
Well, I'm a little unique in that I have always been going back to my family in the Midwest, and over COVID, with nothing to do, I set up this second studio in our Michigan location. And so I spend 2 or 3 months out of the year.
That's pretty good.
So I already kind of have this kind of I've got the big city, but I also have this country place to go to when I need to go to it. And so, my long term, I don't know whether I'll be in LA or Michigan, but people who know me in LA they all know that I bounce back and forth. It's pretty typical for me to be out of town.
Yeah, and to maintain your connections out there when you were at Northwestern, and obviously your Michigan ties. I mean, it's not something that you want to just throw away.
Yeah, and I work with people in Chicago once in a while, and
and you work with Fifth House Ensemble, which is
I did. They folded this past year.
Oh, really? Just they've been
17 years, I think. They were around for 17 years. The musicians are, of course, still playing. But yeah, we did our last series. I did a couple of concerts with them this past year, conducting the Journey live show, and then they ended up shutting down right at the beginning of summer, like the end of May or June or something.
Well, people are getting older. They have families. Maybe they get a job somewhere where they're kind of tied down.
I know that they were facing some pretty heavy turnover issues, partly due to COVID, partly due to the people getting older and changing things, and so the core people there just wasn't quite the same. But some of them have gone off to start smaller chamber groups. I still write to them to people from Fifth House once in a while if I want them to like demo a part for me or something like that. So those are the main Chicago people that I've been working with.
Yeah, I'm glad this was brought up because I wanted to ask you about this. I mean, I know that you've done it. I've never really asked too many specifics about it, but your collaboration with Austin Wintory and the Journey Live series is very. I mean, for me as a classical composer with a capital C, although I've done film stuff, I feel like you've continued to do the film music route, video game music route. You're like not in it, I would say, 100%. But you are in the sphere.
I would describe myself as a distant satellite orbiting the scoring world. Like I do know people in that world, some of them high up, but my path has been, I've always wanted, since my introduction to the orchestra was really at the movie theater, I think that was kind of the first.
Same.
Was the first sort of like, ooh, that's what I want to do. But over the course of undergrad, the classical music, the idea of what you can do with that when you have a captive audience, the sort of emotive and formal storytelling, if you want to call it that, musical experiences you can create, to me became just as interesting as film scoring. I remember I think it was my junior year. I don't know if it was before or after this Superimpose got played, but they hosted, or maybe it was our senior year. Northwestern hosted a 75th birthday festival for John Corigliano.
Okay.
And they played a bunch of stuff. They played Circus Maximus, Clarinet Concerto. They staged Ghost of Versailles, Gazebo Dances, his quarter-tone piano duet, which
Chiaroscuro.
They did a big chamber concert with that on it and some other things. There was a masterclass session where people did piano reductions of his other concertos. And I had always been a huge fan of Elliot Goldenthal's music growing up. And of course, Goldenthal studied with Corigliano for like 7 years. And so that intersection of cinematic style with the experimental, with the larger than life sort of approach to orchestras or wind ensemble, whatever, really started to get me interested in, maybe I could just, like the classical side of things could be a bigger part of what I want to do. And that kind of, and so it wasn't an immediate thing. It wasn't like I went to Circus Maximus and my entire life changed. It wasn't like that, but it was a gradual discovery through my teachers at Northwestern, through the concerts I was going to where when I was done at Northwestern, I kind of felt like I love film music and game music, but I also love classical music. I think I would like a career that somehow tries to do both, which may or may not be the easiest route, but it's the route that I feel most comfortable in pursuing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's not right for everyone, but I feel like it's not, the word is not permission. It's another word that I'm looking for, but seeing that someone else has done it before, classical and film, because you hear about Aaron Copland doing film and classical at the same time. You hear about Prokofiev and people like that, but that's not really what like people like Goldenthal are doing.
No.
Or what you're doing, where it's more like this kind of true intersection between storytelling in both avenues. Because when I listen to your music, it does feel like storytelling is at the forefront. And it's unapologetic storytelling.
And I think that I've gotten to the point where people listen to my recent stuff and they'll ask me, "Oh, is there a story behind this?" Mm-hmm. And most of the time there isn't. It's just I think it's just become part of who I am, and so which is great, because one of the things I like about our genre, the classical genre, is that it doesn't prescribe all the time what your experience needs to be. Like the imagination of the audience has a lot of leeway. And I think that's what drew me to it so powerfully when I was growing up. So it is, I think very rewarding for me to be able to write in those styles, but without necessarily needing a program, which is may sound ironic because I'm coming from a film music aesthetic or love of film music from my growing up days, but yeah, when I'm working with a director whom I really trust, I'll just tell them, like, for me the storytelling is like just the tip of the iceberg. There's all this, like, for me, more interesting musical technical stuff happening, and sometimes you find directors whom you can have that conversation with and they'll get into it, and when
you say technical stuff, you mean technical stuff happening with the music, or happening
with the music, like the
structure,
the instrumentation, the orchestration, where yes, there are the characters and the emotions, but there's also this motivic manipulation going on. It's fun to be able to find collaborators for whom you can kind of get beyond the stereotypical way people talk about film music into something that's for me a little bit more interesting. You can't always do that with every director, because sometimes they just want to talk about the characters and the story, which is totally fine. It's totally relevant. But I feel like having the classical background and having done a lot of classical music, allows me to do a little bit more under the hood, or at least I feel like I'm able to do that more if I hadn't, as opposed to if I hadn't, if I'd just gone to school and been, I'm doing nothing but scoring films. So if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, when you're doing nothing but scoring films, I mean, it becomes more of like, okay, I gotta make sure it doesn't become like, okay, I gotta be very good technically at my craft.
Sure.
It becomes, I gotta finish this project fast. And if I finish it fast and it's good enough, 70, 80%, as good as I could make it, and the director is happy, I checked all the boxes,
right?
And the director is impressed I was able to finish the thing fast, so he's not so worried. She is worried about so many other things happening on the project. Of course, the last thing they care about, I mean, they do care about the score, obviously, but they don't want to, but they care more about being anxious about the score getting done.
Yeah, of course.
They don't want to sit there and sit, how did you figure out every other second?
And that's why I said, you can't have that, I only have that conversation if I've worked with somebody, maybe multiple times, or if they have a music background, which sometimes you find people who played in high school or whatever.
It's very interesting you mentioned this, because this a very similar thing to what you're saying happened to me back when I was scoring films at USC. I had my buddy, who I still keep in touch with, Ali Kareem. I did a couple of films for him. a Iraqi film director who's out in Texas.
Yeah.
And I don't remember who asked about this first. Maybe it was me. I think I invited him to come to my apartment at USC and just watch me write to his picture.
Yeah.
He just sat there for like 4 or 5 hours, and I just was writing. And by the end of the 4 or 5 hours, I showed him what I was doing. I showed him how much was done, just to give him an idea of like what's realistic in a 4 or 5 hour time period. But he was very interested in just seeing the process. Just like how you might go onto a set and see how how long it takes 1 minute of footage to get in the can. It takes a while,
so it takes a while.
But it's rare to have a director or producer that is that invested in the other part of the process.
Yeah.
Not that's not the reason I didn't want to continue. I mean, I think it was just because kind of like you're just so obsessed with figuring out how can I get better technically as a composer, and it's very hard to do that if you're just doing like commercial music.
And I think
it's just hard.
I'm also lucky in that the type of film music that I was coming across growing up had a lot of stuff going under the hood that was really tight from a technique point of view, while also providing the listener with a clear stylistic voice that also, on top of all that, was also fitting the film and doing all that it needs to do.
I know that you were doing. I didn't know about this before, but I was looking at your CV, and it said that you were like an archivist at USC, right?
That was a fun little side job. So when I was doing my doctorate, you can do minors as your doctorate. So my minors were conducting and screen scoring. So I took a couple of classes over at the film music school, or the screen scoring school as it's now referred to. And I remember I had to meet with the chair of the department before getting approved for the minor, which was all fine. And I got to know a few other people there. And I don't think they get too many DMA students doing the minor. I don't think it's a super popular thing. I think by the time you reach either master's degree or DMA age, you've either gone one way or the other.
Right,
but then there's people like me, people like Jules who are interested in doing both. So they knew I was a DMA student, and I think I didn't get that job. I think the first thing they asked me to do was, I think one of their guest speakers, because they bring in composers the same way that the composition school does every week. One of their guest speakers was a composer who had a daughter at USC, and apparently this person asked the chair, "Do you have any students that could help tutor my daughter in theory?"
Okay.
Like maybe like 2 or 3 sessions just to get her through the final.
Yeah.
And so since I was the DMA student, they asked me, and I was like, "Yeah, okay, why not?" It seems like you never know when saying yes to a gig's gonna, pay off. And so I did that. It was fine. And then I remember I can't remember if this was before or after the premiere of my violin concerto, because the chair, I sent an email to the department saying, "Hey, I know you guys are busy. I know it's the screen scoring program, and you guys are, up 24 hours a day doing your 2-year program that's squeezed into 1 year. But I actually have 2 pieces being played on campus. There's the NMO concert, and then I've got something happening on the USC Edge Contemporary Ensemble thing. If anyone's interested, it's free." And Dan Carlin, the chair of the department, actually came to the Edge concert and heard my violin concerto.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I was like, "Whoa, it's pretty cool."
Yeah, it is.
So
crazy.
I think so. And I which was really neat. And I think it was after that they contacted me saying, hey, so we have a bunch of donated stuff, scores and memorabilia, random things from Sean Murphy, who's one of the big Hollywood recording engineers. We have a bunch of boxes of that just sitting in our drum cage cabinet.
God.
And we've gotten inquiries from Intrada Records about they're looking for some James Horner stuff. Would you like to go through those boxes and go through all those scores and just catalog them and let us know what's actually there? Because we haven't actually looked at it.
It's just there for many years,
sitting
just
there.
collecting dust.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
So I took like a bunch of boxes home that with like Sean Murphy scores that he, for like John Williams stuff and James Horner stuff and Danny Elfman stuff and a bunch of other random things. You know, I had it at my house and I just, put it all into an Excel spreadsheet. Ironically, they didn't have the thing that Intrada was looking for. But it was a cool little opportunity to see, just to have a bunch of scores. And these are from guys for whom the orchestrators were all doing handwritten scores. So all these scores were handwritten.
Is that just because
for the most part, yeah.
It was better for time to use handwritten, or
I think it was
time, or was it before finale? And
I think most of these things were from like the 80s and 90s.
Okay, so still not when.
So it was like a transitionary period where people who were doing the jobs were still way faster at pencil and paper. So that was the gig. It lasted like 3 weeks, but I got paid.
When you did that, I mean, obviously it's a big opportunity to learn too when you see, because were there any scores in particular or passages in particular where you thought, wow, like this is like a real technical mastery, or this is like, I can't believe they put something like this in a film. It's like so specific. Or
most of the stuff I saw was stuff that I had heard already. Either I'd seen the movie or had heard the soundtrack. But it was cool seeing like they had Williams' score for Crystal Skull in there.
Indiana Jones.
Yeah. And so seeing that on paper was like, oh, that's how he does it. And there were a few John Williams sketches in there. And of course, the sketches, for the film music nerds out there, probably know this already, but Williams's sketches, they're either 8 staves or 16 staves. And they're definitely shorthand, but they are more or less every detail is on them.
So the sketches you saw were by his hand, like original manuscripts?
I feel like they were photocopies.
Okay.
Because again, these were from recording sessions, so things would have been copied to get them to everybody. So I can't remember exactly if there were too many original manuscripts as opposed to copies. They were mostly copies, I would guess. But no, it's like, so I had a bunch of cues from Crystal Skull. I had a bunch of cues from Lost World, the second Jurassic Park movie. And yeah, so I had those in my house for about 3 weeks while I sorted through everything. And of course, I gave them all back. But
yeah.
But that was just a fun little thing to do, and it was a nice way to spend a month.
Yeah, I mean, I did something also. I mean, I didn't get paid for it, but
I got paid. So
you got paid. That's a better deal than me. But I learned a lot. I was going through the James Newton Howard down.
I've done that.
You've been there?
I went there for a day. Yeah.
Yeah. So he donated his entire catalog to USC.
The cool thing,
a couple decades ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So that collection is there. I went and looked at that for a day, an afternoon. But it's an interesting time because, especially for people who are into those guys, those types of composers, because a lot of their music is getting it's getting re-released in like complete score, editions on record through like a handful of labels that are in LA. Because it used to be usually when you bought a soundtrack album, you wouldn't get all the music from the movie. You'd get as much as the studio could afford to pay the union to license, which could be up. In the case of John Williams, it was usually a full CD. but often cases it would be more like 40 minutes, LP length. So a lot of that music is being released in its complete form nowadays, which is great for anyone who's interested in it, and also great for anyone looking to study it. And there are two companies that have only sprung up in like the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, that are publishing in book form, digitally notated, the full scores of major movies. One company is called Omni Music Press. The other is a company that's named after the guy who owns it. It's Chris Siddell, and those are making for very interesting study materials as well. I don't do nearly as much score studying these days as I used to, just because I'm how busy I am. But yeah, I think those things are going to become very popular music libraries for undergrads to look at.
And these scores are meant for study, or they're also meant to be performed?
I think originally they were hoping that they could be used as performance scores, but I don't think they're really. They would be difficult to conduct from, and I've yet to hear of anybody conducting from those specific editions. For the big film to live to picture concerts that go on nowadays, for like Star Wars and Harry Potter and Titanic or whatever, you're getting a huge tabloid, two editions of tabloid, Act 1, Act 2. Those, I mean, as you probably know, as you know from doing orchestra music, like, you got to make the score easy for the conductor to read. And the editions I'm talking about, they really are more study editions. They're like 9x12 books with like as many bars on the page as possible.
Oh, I see. They're just kind of done as quickly as possible, just to get as much music out there.
I think they're definitely trying to save as much paper as possible.
Okay.
And it is a lot of music. It's like 2 hours of music per edition.
Yeah.
But I would not want to conduct from those editions. They're just too small.
Right.
You could theoretically, but if you go to any like live to picture concert for Star Wars or Superman, or the Harry Potter ones that are being done now, the conductor is conducting from a full, at least tabloid-sized thing.
And those are like packages. I mean, you can't just like, I don't think you can just
those you can't buy commercially.
Yeah,
the ones I'm talking about, you can buy commercially from the websites.
Right.
They're actually published.
Right, that makes sense.
So they are study scores, but they're not small. They're like 9x12.
Mm-hmm.
And those, are, really interesting to, having grown up listening to film music and having no access to any of that. It's really cool to at least be able to see, to have access to look at that sort of thing now. Although, the scores themselves are not entirely perfect. You sometimes hear discrepancies between what you hear on the recording versus what's in the score. And so I would not call them, what these two companies are doing, I would not call them critical editions, so to speak.
Right.
They're definitely not urtext, so to speak. When they first started publishing them, there was kind of a hope that people would start organizing performances, but they have really, I think, realized that they're really only useful as study materials.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of people who are interested in film music who will find those study materials very useful.
I just wonder what will happen like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now because all the scores being made now, they're not just, straight up acoustic scores. Yeah. I mean, the integral part of scores are what they're doing in the box, in the computer. So I wonder what will be the equivalent of that for study, Will it be helpful to have can you imagine like having stems or something?
I know that I mean, that's what, like, I know that film scoring programs at universities, that for them is like really what they try to get is those assets. Like not just somebody's files from, composer's files or sequencer sessions, but also, clips from the films with all the music removed so that the students can practice.
No, but even the clips of the movie, like like seeing the new Fantastic Beasts movie, and just seeing like the original, just seeing all the stems, or even going back further and seeing all the MIDI inputs, like or the actual orchestral template, like what Junkie XL does, on his YouTube channel. He goes through the whole. This is my MIDI. For people that are really interested, it's fascinating because you can see his template. You could see all him putting in live. I mean, he's redoing it because he obviously already composed the cue, but he's showing you, here's my tempo map. Here's what I was thinking when this cue hit. Like he would explain to you. And I wonder if this is going to be like the, Urtext kind of version of film music.
It's funny because that stuff obviously is not. I think that the difference is that the notated music has made the jump between in the box to this is going to go in front of human beings to play. Whereas if you're just a sequencer file and all your plugins and whatever, that's even if you want it to be recorded eventually, you're not at that stage. Like you don't yet need to put it into a standardized form of notation and then publish it either, or copy it for other people to look at. So that's an interesting question, is like, how would people study the composers of today, their sequencer files? I mean, even for me, because I actually do, when I'm scoring films, I definitely, depending on the context, will occasionally leave the pen and paper just completely out of the process and do a lot of improvising into the computer. And it's hard to imagine, giving that to, let's say, a student or a younger person, and them actually looking at it and gleaning, some very specific, or knowing what specifically to look for. But I'm sure someone will figure it out. I mean, the YouTube thing. There's at least one person on YouTube whose name I forget, who has been doing this thing where they reconstruct cues from, like, famous cues from movies that are mostly electronic and trying to get them as close as possible.
Oh yeah, I've seen a lot of channels like that where they like mock up the cue in Cubase or something. Yeah, it sounds pretty good too. Actually, it's like 80%, 90% there. I mean,
it's so. I think people have that covered one way or another. But for me, who's and that's the interesting thing about how I kind of went about figuring out the sequencer side of things is mostly. I mean, I think I took one class in music production during school. The rest I ended up kind of teaching myself, but whatever I was doing, the guiding light was always like just knowing what I wanted it to sound like, which may sound obvious, but it, if you go into if you don't have a lot of music tech experience, and I certainly don't think of myself as a a master of Logic or that sort of thing, but people always compliment me on my mixes, and all I can tell them is I just know what I want it to sound like, and I just work at it till I get it there. There's usually a lot of Google searches involved trying to figure things out. And there are probably a lot of things I'm doing that probably aren't the most efficient way of doing those things. But I think that the fact that I, have listened to a lot of music, I've gone to a lot of concerts, and really know what I want my stuff to sound like, really helps guide, my ability to solve problems in the sequencer.
And you're not doing it en masse either. It's not like you got to churn something out every day.
Right.
You're not one of these. I mean, that's just the nature of that business, you got to work 16 hours a day, and you got to, and usually it's like one thing you're really good at.
Yeah.
And that is what you're being paid for, whether you're synthestrating or whether you're just engraving, or whether you're your job is to just do programming, or your job is to just do technical setup. Just everything in the studio, your job is to make sure it's technically running.
Yeah.
The way you think and the way I think too is like, I'd like to be good at, reasonably good at everything.
Yeah.
And if there's something that I really can't do, okay, I'll hire that out for that one time out of every once in a blue moon.
Sure.
But I also, like you, I don't feel that I'm like the most technically capable at Logic or even at Sibelius. I should even point out, like I don't find myself to be the fastest person in that program. I don't know all the hotkeys.
I definitely feel more at home in Finale than I do in Logic, but it is, I mean, unless you're doing it more or less 90 to 100% of your time, you're not going to have that mastery over it. And if you don't need to have that mastery in order to get your work done, then I don't worry about it.
But what you said before, I think is an extremely important takeaway, which is what you want it to sound like.
And that has been very useful in how I edit recordings of my orchestral music, because you get a performance, you get some sort of recording, which is usually a little bit too dry. There may be some mistakes in it here or there, or somebody didn't come in. And if you're lucky, you have a dress rehearsal or some other thing to use. And so I think when it comes, the electronic side of what I do has actually been enormously valuable when it comes to handling recordings of acoustic music and getting them not just sounding decent, but just sounding as kind of like attention grabbing or even bringing out the qualities that I had in mind when I was writing the piece, even more than what we were able to get on the stage.
And not just like following a step of things that people typically do, but following your ear is really what it is. And I mean, the same thing is when you're composing as well. Like, I feel I always know what image I want. But I never have, at least for me, I don't know how it is for you, but with me, it's like, whenever I start a piece, there's always that tension in the beginning. But once I have an idea, like a concept, I'm like, all right, that's it. That's it. I'm excited. I know the image in my head, and I'm just excited to start working, with that, like the spark. And it's like this thing where I don't know how I'm going to get there, right? Necessarily. I don't know exactly which pitches and with what rhythms, but I know the feeling, and even past the feeling, I know how I want my ears to feel over a span of time. I think the same thing.
I mean, there are surprises once in a while, especially if I start doing extended technique stuff. I might get a sound or a gesture that I didn't anticipate, which sometimes can improve the piece. Sometimes I have to change it, but I think that is part of your training, is just developing those instincts for what you actually want your piece to sound like, and that will flow into not just your rehearsal technique, but also your things you're doing before the performance, and also things you do after the performance with the recording. Because, as you know, the recordings they're the first impression. They're the most important thing, I think.
And they're the most immediately accessible thing. I mean, if I want to listen to your piece, that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm not going to look up a Patrick O'Malley concert. That's not going to be the first thing I do. Because that's the moment of friction right there. Is, but that is the best way to listen to a piece, I still think, is at a live show versus the recording.
You definitely get something in a live show that you don't get at a recording. But once the show is over, then I treat the recording very much as its own thing. And what was okay on stage is not necessarily okay on the recording, and I might have to fix it.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, the most recent thing was this viola concerto, and we were told, well, you'll get a recording in like 2 weeks, and my soloist Brett had met the engineer and had listened to a bit of the live mix that they had from the rehearsal, and come up to me and said, hey, it's actually sounding really good. And I had said, okay, but like, wait for me to get my hands on it before we start, because I'm gonna do, a lot to it,
right?
Guaranteed. So, and it always pays off. I think that so many of those opportunities that you and I wound up at, the orchestral stuff, I think a big part of that was the fact that I went in. I didn't just take the recording and send it off. I took the recording and really sat down with it in the electronic space, and listened to everything multiple times and really said, is this really the best that it can sound without obviously changing the music? And so I think that really is something, something that I'm telling all my students to do, is like, don't just take a recording and and then just put it on your website. Like, really, really ask yourself, is that really what I wanted to hear?
Yeah, because it's you gotta, like, I always say composing is a very narcissistic endeavor, because you're expecting someone to sit there for, especially a concerto, half an hour concerto, you're expecting them to sit there and listen to it with attention. It's not like watching a film where your many senses are being stimulated at once. It's a full...
there's a narrative, there's a more less abstract narrative thing happening.
Yeah, and that layer, and I feel like whenever you're consuming a piece of content, you want the audience to be invested.
Yeah. Right?
And it's just harder. That barrier, I think, for the kind of music we write is just harder.
Yeah.
But once you get someone invested, you got them. Yeah, I think even in a stronger pull than other kinds of media, if you have the right type of person that is listening to the music. I really believe that. So I heard your concerto, of course, and like what I was saying before about the idea of storytelling, like all your pieces have this kind of vein, but this piece really, I thought, did so because of the concerto aspect.
Sure.
Yeah, the violist there. You can't help but having that person be the protagonist of the story.
Of course, yeah.
You can't help but make that association. Yeah. And once you make that association, it doesn't leave. Leave your brain. It's not like, you have many stretches where the violist doesn't play or is being drowned out on purpose, but you always are remembering, hey, the viola, where is the viola the entire time?
Yeah.
You don't get in like a normal orchestral piece where it's more like this general image.
Yeah,
that you're getting, like a landscape or something.
Sure.
That you're watching, like many hills changing over time kind of vibe I get when I listen to Bruckner or something.
Yeah, of course. Especially with that piece, the viola concerto, because I listened to a good deal of contemporary, shall we say, viola concertos, going all the way back to like Walton and Hindemith. And a lot of them tended to use either chamber orchestras or some sort of reduced orchestra. I guess because they think it's the alto voice of the strings, and it's just one string, so it's really not that loud, and so you don't want to overpower it. And for whatever reason, I just knew I wanted to use a full orchestra for this concerto, and which meant that I had to really be very careful with making sure the violist was heard. And many times the solution is just to have the orchestra not play, or play in a way that is not going to obstruct the violist even slightly. There's a few places where I do it on purpose, but it's a minority of the instances. And so I feel like the concerto, when I listen to it, I'm actually like, the amount of times where the viola and the orchestra are actually playing together in some sort of harmonic and or contrapuntal way is actually quite minimal for a lot of concertos. But on the other hand, but it's also adding, I think it's also highlighting the soloist as that protagonist even more in a case, which to me is like, kind of like, it's a nice, fun aspect to that piece that's different than, other pieces I wrote.
Oh yeah, it's very different, and it's different than a lot of concertos because, I mean, I guess it doesn't help much for people watching if you haven't heard the piece, but just as a general thing, I mean, your piece has like 6 or 7, I would say, true cadenzas where the soloist is playing literally by himself.
Right.
It's pretty rare. Usually it's like 1 or 2 cadenzas maximum in this kind of length concerto. And that every time it came up, I was always surprised. Wow, another cadenza. But it always was like a nice thing. I didn't feel like, oh, I'm not hearing the orchestra. Like, I want to hear the orchestra. No, every time the violist became a soloist, I was like, oh, wow, how often do you hear the violist really playing by himself? Mm-hmm. It's kind of rare, Yeah. You hear viola solos within a context of an orchestral piece. It's usually a violin soloist or even a cello soloist sometimes. Yeah. Oboe, English horn solo, classic. But you gave the violist, I mean, if I was writing a viola concerto, I wouldn't have thought myself to do that many true solos where literally no percussion, no nothing is going on in the background.
Yeah, I mean, that's something else that I have, I think, been experimenting with in other pieces as well, is the idea of, just because you have all those people on stage, do they really all need to play all the time? And of course, it's different for each piece. In some pieces, like especially if you're writing for younger players, you should have everyone involved pretty consistently. But when you're writing for pro players, I think there are very interesting dramatic things you can do by juxtaposing everyone playing versus very few or nobody playing, or certain dedicated textures that last for long stretches of time when you're leaving people out. And because of the orchestrational logistics of the viola concerto, it just kind of lended itself to that avenue without me really thinking too philosophically about it. But yeah, it seems to be, now that in hindsight, it seems to be like a nice, kind of aspect or feature of the piece.
You took a weakness of the viola and made it a feature of the piece in a formal way. I don't know if you were thinking of that while you're writing it, but it comes off that way from the first listening, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and very different from the piece I'm recording this week, which is the violin concerto, which that piece is, our school performance of it is available for people to listen to. And that piece, there's much more intertwining between the ensemble and the soloist, partly because it's a violin, so it can soar high above orchestrationally, and also it's a sinfonietta orchestration, so it's much easier to weave in and out of different chamber combinations and all that.
Yeah, smaller than an orchestra, and you don't have all the bells and whistles of the big percussion section, a big brass section to worry about.
Right.
And the other thing I notice is when you introduce big brass sounds, it becomes the elephant in the room. It's like in the sense that, I heard a big brass sound. Is it going to come back again?
Yeah.
It's just so. When you hear a sound like, especially when you're using triads and things like that, where it's producing acoustically, it's giving you what you want, right? You get that dopamine hit when you hear C major, horn triad or something, and you always are thinking, well, when is it going to come back? And it's the same thing in Beethoven or something like this. But when you have a smaller sinfonietta ensemble, you don't have that. So you gotta, it's gotta be, okay, where am I, for lack of a better term, where are my dopamine hits coming?
Yeah.
What textures do that? How do I weave in and out?
Yeah.
And this is something I'm always thinking about because I write a lot for chamber music now. It's like, where do I get those?
Right.
Where do I save those moments for?
Yeah. That's interesting because I think the last time you were in LA, or the last time we hung out in LA, we'd heard Tacht had gotten the orchestral version.
Yeah.
And played. And that piece, to me, which is interesting because it was originally a sinfonietta piece, right? A 15-ish.
Yeah, that was
people.
The first version. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an instance where, and I haven't tried that. I haven't taken a sinfonietta piece and done an orchestra version or vice versa. I've done orchestra and bass solo, as you know.
That's crazy. Although I think was I the one that put that thought
you
in
inspired
your head?
that because of the Come On fantasy.
Yeah, taking a 2-player piece and make it for 80
right.
people.
Well, one of those 2 players was a piano, so that makes it
it makes it easier.
A little bit easier to imagine, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I just thought of it as like that's a genius way for me to not spend an entire year writing one piece.
Yeah.
So
that's what people were doing back in the day, though. They would make these little piano sketches,
right.
Or even listed it the other way around. Of course,
sure.
Taking a big Beethoven piece and make it into
the piano
2-hand piece. I mean, why not? Yeah, it's not against the law or anything.
No, but it was. I guess I just hadn't really thought to imagine one of my chamber pieces being blown up like that. But the thing interesting about Talked is hearing those 2 different versions. I don't think I believe I did hear Kaleidoscope play live, the chamber music version, the sinfonietta version. And I'm just curious, do you have a preference out of those 2 versions, or what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of?
The ironic thing is the orchestra version has been played more times than the chamber version. Well, I don't know why. Just
probably because the chamber. How many is it? 15 people.
15 players. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a weird group.
Yeah, there's not that many ensembles.
Right.
I mean, there were just a lot more orchestras out there than a 15-player ensemble. I kind of like the sinfonietta version more, to be honest, because I can just hear the harp more. The harp is such a big feature in that piece. The harp kind of gets lost in the orchestra version, and I have to double it with a lot of other weird effects in the orchestra to get the general effect that I want from the orchestra, from the harp. And I like the sound of the harpist singing in the beginning, and just have her sing. I don't necessarily like it too much because in the orchestra version I have the harp singing in the beginning, but then many other voices also sing, which kind of makes the sound a little bit more like a choir, which is not really what I want it to sound like. I want it to sound like a singular voice. So they were definitely actually blowing it up to a bigger size. Actually had to introduce a lot more compromises. It was the other way around. Even though I had more players, I had to introduce more compromises into the sound world. Yeah, if that makes sense.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, with that particular piece. But yeah, I would rather hear the sinfonietta piece, the sinfonietta version again. And there are some things in the strings where the harmonics and the ornamentation just is a lot more clear when you have one person per part doing it.
All people do.
Whereas in the orchestra, I knew that wasn't going to happen, so I just went the other way. I said, let's just make it real messy.
Yeah. Okay.
And have everyone playing a slightly different thing instead of trying to get them all to play like these really exact grace notes in the exact right place. The concept of the piece changed from the original idea, but it's still the same piece.
Yeah, of course.
It's the same length and the same.
Yeah, I think I felt the same way. Like I feel like I can hear more. There's more. I can hear the details of the chamber version better. The orchestra, of course, has a bigger sound and a bigger, shall we say, impact, if you will.
Yeah.
But since you wrote the chamber version first, I think those features feel more at home in that version to me.
Of course, yeah. And it's just like you were saying, a lot of it is not creative either. In terms of the reasoning, it's like, well, I want to write more orchestra music, but I don't have time to write more orchestra music. Yeah. So what do I do instead? Like, what are my options here? Like, I'm not interested in having 3 hours of sleep a night, so that's out of the. I'm trying to have a more normal life, so
sure.
So what are my options? So it's almost like I ran options, and that's what the option was. Like, how do I take that piece and make it into a bigger piece? And I do that with basically every piece. If there is an opportunity for me to make a small piece to a big piece, or vice versa, I will do it without even thinking.
Sure,
I will just do it. You know, especially if I'm enthusiastic, and it's even easier when someone is interested in it.
Yeah, of course.
in a new version, then I will do it. Like, it's just, I don't think about like the creative part of it or the ethical part of it. Although I don't think some people think about that, but I don't think that's even.
I don't know if that'd be applicable to what we're doing.
No, but some people will. When you first tell someone that's what you do, I feel like that's the first thing that hits their mind. But when you actually when you see what the process is like, it's like it is work. It's not like flipping a switch and turning on ChatGPT and being like, hey, make this into a...
It really only becomes a problem if the final product, comes off as lazy in any way, or comes off as arbitrary. And I have heard that in a few instances with some people. But most of the time, we're dealing with something that is no different than Bach reusing music that he wrote for a cantata as a concerto, or Mahler reusing his songs as symphony movements or something like that. It's completely legit.
Yeah, I think it's also healthy.
Yeah.
You got to think.
And that's something that might lead us into an interesting conversation about personal style and personal identity as a composer. Like because that's something that I found myself really obsessing over in the latter half of my USC days, is like, all these composers have a personal style, and we grow up being told, the obvious, like, oh, do your own thing, have your own style, that's what sets you apart, blah, 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 blah. But nobody tells you how to actually do that, right?
Yeah.
So I actually kind of tried to figure it out, at least from in the context of the type of music I was interested in. So I started, and of course I had been, part of this was brought on by, I think, noticing that starting to hear more modern film music where I didn't feel like I could hear a through line of the composer's style, as opposed to, all the guys we've mentioned so far whose style you can recognize. I, had studied with Andrew Norman for 2 years, and of course he was, kind of became notorious for rewriting, his pieces. And so that kind of like got into my brain about like, okay, how does that work without anyone, with the pieces still feeling like new pieces, but even though he's using similar ideas piece to piece.
That's funny. I'd never thought about it that way.
Well, it depends on what piece you're looking at, but because there are the extreme differences between a piece like Play versus that first piano concerto of his, which is very like quiet the entire way.
Release? No, it's not what it's called. Oh my god!
I feel like it starts with an S.
Suspend.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
think so, yeah.
God, how did I forget? Yeah, Suspend. But in the second one, the Split is completely different, though.
Right. I've never heard that one.
You haven't?
No, it got played in New York, and I just
oh my god, there's so many people that are big Andrew Norman fans that I know that don't know that piece, and I'm
well aware that it exists.
Oh yes. I mean, I know that you know that it exists, obviously.
I suppose I could bug him for a recording,
but he doesn't like that piece.
Yeah,
he wants to. I don't know if I told him though, but that's my favorite piece of his, Split.
Yeah,
and he wants to redo it, or he doesn't want it to get played. I'm like, dude, that thing is. I mean, with the people I was with when I heard that piece with the New York Philharmonic.
Yeah.
I mean, people had chills after hearing that piece. Like, it was like, and he felt like. I remember one composer
I remember the
saying,
rehearsals were a little rough. From what he told me, that there were some things that had to be just axed out, which of course would make anyone feel bad. But
maybe he felt bad during the moment, but I'm kind of derailing this conversation a little bit.
Sure.
But I feel like it's important. But you can't. What was it? You can't dismiss how someone feels about what you did.
Right.
So even if you had a piece and I showed up.
Mm-hmm.
And you just hate what went on, but I come up to you and I'm like, hey, or even I'm telling other people, maybe I don't even come up to you. I just say it privately. Hey, I love this.
I've had that happen.
You can't dismiss how people feel.
A few parts, and it kind of like it's like almost surreal for a moment.
Yeah.
It's like did we hear two different things?
Yeah. Yeah.
But then it usually, as long as, let's say you're getting compliments on it, I find that you come around to that somewhat quickly. Your neurosis about whatever you expected to happen that didn't happen or whatever.
I think it's just also hard for us to, I want to get back to this personal style thing because it's important, but I just think like psychologically, it's important for us to realize that there are compliments that are sincere, and there's also compliments that are, it's just kind of like, and I also think that's part of it too. Like, is this a sincere thing they're telling me, or is this just something that they're telling me because it's the end of the show?
Sure.
And I guess I don't blame people for having that back and forth dialogue.
Yeah, obviously, those conversations happen, whether you want them to or not. But if somebody mentions something specific in my piece, that tends to, I feel like that tends to be genuine, or at least that's what I try to do.
Yeah.
When I hear something of somebody else's, is really like figure out, even if it's a piece I didn't super enjoy, but what was like a moment that I'm going to carry with me out of the concert hall. So studying with Andrew, looking back on film music I really liked versus stuff that I wasn't liking, and which of course might flow into a music criticism conversation. Really just trying to focus on how do you actually create this through line from piece to piece for enough time where people recognize it as your music. And so that was something that I started to listen for more intently when I would listen to other people's music, and also start to kind of look at my own music with a much more, shall we say, technical eye, in terms of okay, what was my, if I take a pre-existing piece that I finished, what were my favorite part? What about it sticks out to me? And then you do a little bit of theoretical analysis, not like hardcore, charts and stuff, but just playing around with the motives, the intervals, the rhythms, and starting to slowly over the course of time kind of compile a sort of list of favorite ideas, and not be afraid to go to that list when writing the new piece or something like that. And I think that, I don't know every instance, obviously. I tend not to remember the actual act of composing most of the time. It's just kind of a blur when I think about.
Same.
Yeah. But I have made it to the point where I'm starting to get comments, more and more often that oh, that sounded like a Patrick O'Malley piece, which is that was my goal. So I feel like I'm making progress in that arena. And so yeah, a combination of looking at my own music in that way, a combination of looking at other people's music in that way. At USC, we don't have to write a dissertation paper, but we do have to write papers for other DMA things.
Mm-hmm.
I had to write a paper for my theory academic field, and I wrote it on Goldenthal, specifically his polystylism, in the sense of, here's a guy who tends to incorporate a lot of different styles into his music, but it still sounds like it's by one person. How does he do that?
Well, Goldenthal is a strange case too, because he's got a symphony in G sharp minor, and then he writes the score to Frida. It's it's crazy. It doesn't make sense.
Yes, but and that was the thing that really, really piqued my interest, was it sounds like the same guy most of the time. You can say all this philosophical, sentimental stuff about, his life experiences or whatever, but I actually got in and was okay, what motives is he using? What orchestration is he using over and over again? Or that's the sort of nitty-gritty musical thing. And so that was the basis of my paper, was here's somebody who is using a lot of different styles, which you would think would be would make it hard for a through line to be heard from a single composer, but here's all this musical activity that's happening.
Is there a way to see that online? Is it public?
You can probably find it through USC's. Oh wait, no. Since it's not a dissertation, it may not be. I think only my violin concerto score is on the USC dissertation thing. But I'm happy to share it with you, of course.
Yeah, I'd love to put that in the description below if you're fine with it, because I think it's really interesting.
It's an interesting
for anyone
case.
that got this far in the show, probably would want to click on that, because I want to read it at least.
Yeah, so. Sure. So and then but when I listen to people's music, and I love doing, if I have time, I love doing marathons, listening marathons, where I'll listen to like a single artist, like I'll just get all their albums. And start to just listen in that way. Obviously, if you have time to score study, that's even better. But usually, I don't. So it is kind of trying to pick out very specific musical things that a person is doing piece to piece.
Yeah, instead of having it just like come to you.
Yeah.
Like or you're like curating your own style in a way.
Yeah,
that's what you're doing.
Yeah,
and you're being very conscious about it.
Yeah, and that to me is something I care a lot about, because I came to realize that it was something I was missing in a lot of contemporary music I was listening to.
Mm-hmm.
The sense of like, here's a main idea in my work that I care about, and it's at the foreground, and somehow. Okay, so you have to worry about just a singular piece in that respect, but then also carrying that toward your other pieces to the extent that you're able to. I mean, obviously, anybody can undergo a big stylistic shift.
Yeah.
In fact, I consider you one of those people who has done that already.
Yeah, yes, definitely, yeah. But that was more of a product of necessity than a product of doing it on purpose. I feel like we're like studying past things. Felt like I hit a wall with what I was
and that's
doing.
when you should switch.
Yeah.
My problem is that I feel like people don't spend enough time with their ideas, and so it's difficult for me to hear or me to get a sense of what they musically care about sometimes.
Right.
And that, of course, leads us into the criticism aspect, which we can.
No, that's great. No, because we were talking about this a little bit earlier before we got on camera, but the idea of, which I never think about, and probably a lot of this comes from my studies with John Corigliano, who said he never reads, I don't know if this is true or not. He told me after the 90s, he never reads any criticism of his music, his concerts. He doesn't want to know.
Right.
He doesn't want to know if it's positive. He doesn't want to know if it's negative. And I kind of just took that stance as default, since then. I was 22, 21, so I'm obviously still very impressionable at that age. And so I guess I never really paid attention to like what people thought of my music. I cared more about like, how do I feel? Like, am I bored?
Yeah.
Like, really, that's like the number one question. Am I bored?
I think it's relevant for me, even if you don't read, your reviews, just being able, in your own compositional and listening life, to be able to actually explain cogently why you like something versus why you don't like something. And that to me, goes into, because I've met people who write music that they don't enjoy listening to. That was like some of those doctorate students at Northwestern, like actually said that.
They said this out loud.
I enjoy thinking about my music more than listening to it, or something like that. Or I remember one older student saying, he came in and showed a piece, and he basically introduced the piece being like, so this piece I've written this piece. This is kind of a new thing for me, because I realized the music I was writing before this, I just didn't enjoy. So that was, so.
That's sad.
Yeah.
It ventures on sad.
Yes. So, and although I have never been in that situation personally,
Right.
I do think it's useful for me, especially when you're going out and hearing stuff, to be able to break things down into why things work versus don't work. It's certainly helpful if you are teaching privately, because you can't just, if a student comes to you with something that's not working, you can't just tell them, it's terrible, see you next week. You have to be able to explain why something's not working.
Right, in a verbal way, and
right.
not just as a, oh yeah, and move on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when I talk about criticism, I'm really not talking about reading reviews of stuff. It's really more, my personal taste and why I think things work versus don't work, and kind of actually going through the process of sorting those things out and then applying them to my own music.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, I remember, I don't think it was at a single concert, but maybe over a span of a year, I'd gone to a number of contemporary music orchestra concerts. And at some point I just realized that I had a very difficult time remembering anything about the music for the most part.
I mean, this is a common thing. Well, I think part of that too is that they always put they put the contemporary pieces on the same program. They put 5, 6 in a row.
Part of it's the programming, for sure, how
does that help? Yeah.
But I also think, the pieces themselves, I mean, yes, if you put a contemporary piece on a concert of nothing but Lauritsen and Whitaker, you would stick in your memory a little bit easier.
Yeah.
But even so, I definitely felt like there were issues happening in the pieces themselves. And so in that particular instance, I remember starting to think much more about what are my main ideas versus my supporting ideas. What is the foreground in what I'm writing versus background? And in the sense of what do I actually want the audience to hear and maybe have a chance of taking with them? Maybe not humming the tunes or anything, but like moments. And that changed the way I dealt with things like certain orchestrational choices and dynamic choices. That was something that I often harp on with students because it's the easiest thing to fix. Mm-hmm. You just change the letter. But it can make a huge difference, especially in a piece where you have many layers going on. So that's an example of like me not liking something and then unpacking it and trying to figure out why do you actually, because it's very easy to say, well, it's just not my thing, or it's just not the style I want.
It's interesting because you make it a technical process from the composition side. Yeah. When you listen to the piece, it doesn't sound technical in a way that a lot of contemporary pieces sound technical in the way that they actually put the pitches down. Yeah. But in the formation of how they got those ideas, it actually might be the opposite. It might not be technical at all. It might be just like, oh, I just want to sound like Fernyhough, or I just want to sound like my professor, which is not a very technical reason to write music at all, actually. Right, exactly. It's just like following a certain trend, or following maybe everyone else will like me if I write it this certain way, which is not a technical way to approach it at all.
Yeah, and so that sort of thing, that's what I mean when I talk about music criticism, is not actual journalists. I don't really care that much about reviews, although I will read reviews usually, just to see if there's anything useful I can throw on the website. But I'm talking about my own abilities as a critic, as a personal critic, not a professional one.
Well, also,
and how that can influence my music. Because everybody likes to bitch about music, but it's like, to me, I want there to be a productive angle to it.
Yeah, productive bitching.
Yeah, right.
And criticism word is interesting because it's in between pieces also, which I feel like composers don't really do. At least I don't. I'm just like, all right, I'm not composing for a month. That's it. I don't think about composing. But it sounds like to you, it's like, all right, what did I take away from this piece that I can put in the next piece? You're active about it. I'm not so much like this. I kind of like to compartmentalize it. When I'm composing, that's my time to compose. I honestly don't really think about. The most that I think about when I'm composing is reading like papers or reading more than ever now. I read a lot of scholarly articles about things for the next piece, and it's more just reading and than anything else. Not literally composing, just to like have
that makes sense for the type of music you write, where you're usually interacting with some sort of pre-existing practice.
Yeah.
Whereas me, I'm kind of just,
well, you are
doing whatever.
Interacting with the pre-existing practice too.
I am, but there isn't the sort of, it's not the same cultural thing happening.
Yeah, but it's still a matter of you're dealing with motive, you're dealing with intervals, you're dealing with functional harmony, right? Or when do I use it, when do I don't? Like you have a moment in your piece where it's boom, boom, you got a 5/1 cadence out of nowhere, but you played the audience to that point. You knew when to put it there.
Yeah,
there was that recognition of what that is from the audience, of course.
Right.
You're playing with perception, memory. So you are dealing with things that you could read about in a scholarly way if you wanted to. Yeah, but that's everyone deals with it in a different way.
Yeah.
With me, I hit a wall. I needed to go deeper into the text to figure out what are those intervals that I want to use.
I feel like for me, I'm always trying to catch up with my my music collection, and if I'm in between pieces, that's usually when I try and actually go online and go to all the, think about what ensembles are in town. I should go see what their schedules are, because usually I don't do that.
Who is that? Guest. There is a guest in our show today. This is my wife, Ambra.
Hi.
What's going on?
I'm done with the call, but I need to do something, and I think Ivy needs to go out.
All right. Well, maybe this is a good time to stop. All right. Well, thanks. Thanks so much for being on.
Right.
I got Patrick's details down in the description below. You can check out his music. The viola concerto is not online yet.
No, that's so that obviously major orchestra here in the U.S. You can't use those recordings,
right?
Except for private purposes. But we are hoping to certainly do a commercial recording of that.
Awesome.
Within hopefully the next couple of years.
Cool. All right, check out the music down below, and we'll see you in the next one.